الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما أما بعد فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله وأحسن الحديث لمحمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة. This will be the last khutbah in our series on Surah Al-Isra until after Eid, inshaAllah ta'ala. Previously in this chapter, Allah ta'ala had spoken about the rights of our parents, the rights of our relatives, and the rights of the poor. But Allah Azza wa Jalla recognizes that it's not always possible to give even to the most worthy of causes. Allah then says, وَإِمَّا تُعْرِضَنَّ عَنْهُمُ ابْتِغَاءَ رَحْمَةٍ مِّن رَّبِّكَ تَرْجُوهَا فَقُل لَّهُمْ قَوْلًا مَيْسُورًا. But if you must turn anyone down while you still hope for mercy from your Lord, then at least give them a kind word. Allah Azza wa Jalla is telling us that if we are honest about what we can give, then there is no shame in admitting when we can't. It is not praiseworthy to overcommit ourselves or to give other people false hope. Even if we can't control our provision and the amount that we have to give, we can control our interaction with the person who is asking us. We can actually cause our interaction to not only be pleasant, but to be an act of charity that takes the place of the money and assistance that we cannot give. The Prophet ﷺ said, كل معروف صدقة وإن من المعروف أن تلقى أخاك بوجه طلق. Every goodness is charity, and certainly among the good things is to meet your brother with a smiling face. Not only should we be upfront about our ability to give or not, we also need to be responsible in what we give. Allah Azza wa Jalla reminds us to be moderate even in our charity by saying next, وَلَا تَجْعَلْ يَدَكَ مَغْلُولَةً إِلَى عُنُقِكَ وَلَا تَبْسُطْهَا كُلَّ الْبَسْطِ فَتَقْعُدَ مَلُومًا مَحْسُورًا. Don't be tight-fisted, for if you do so, you will be blameworthy. But also don't be too open-handed, or you will end up in poverty. Allah Azza wa Jalla tells us here that the principle of moderation in Islam even reaches to the amount of charity that we give. Allah Azza wa Jalla describes our ummah as a nation of moderation. He said, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا لِتَكُونُوا شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ. Accordingly, we made you a moderate nation to be an example, so that you would be an example for all people. As Muslims, we are supposed to be moderate in everything. When it comes to how much we enjoy this life, we are moderate. We don't just do whatever it is that we want. We have limits. But those limits are not so severe and suffocating that we also can't have any fun at all. We are moderate when it comes to self-defense. We aren't the bloodthirsty savages like the media makes us out to be. But we also aren't so extremely peaceful that we let ourselves be bullied or pushed around. Allah Azza wa Jalla is telling us here in this ayah that even in what we give of charity, we have to be moderate. We can't be stingy, keeping everything to ourselves. That's not fair. But Allah also doesn't ask us to give so much that it's a burden upon us. He doesn't ask so much of us that it becomes difficult to live. The federal income tax is anywhere between 10 and 37% of your income, what you make. Allah Azza wa Jalla only asks you to pay 2.5%, not of what you make, but of what sits for over a year. One time the Prophet ﷺ was visiting one of the companions, and this companion was on his deathbed. He was about to die. The companion told the Prophet ﷺ that he was very rich, but he only had one single son to inherit all of his money. The companion felt bad about this. He felt guilty. And so he wanted to give a large proportion of his wealth to charity. He asked the Prophet ﷺ for permission to give 2/3 of his wealth in charity. The Prophet ﷺ said no. The man persisted. He still felt guilty. He asked, can I at least give 1/2 in charity? Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said no. Finally, he asked for the Prophet ﷺ's permission to give 1/3 of his wealth in charity, and finally, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, "Thuluth, wa thuluth kathir." Yes, okay, give 1/3 of it, but even 1/3 is an awful lot. Then the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّكَ أَن تَذَرَ وَرَثَتَكَ أَغْنِيَاءَ خَيْرٌ مِنْ أَن تَذَرَهُمْ عَالَةً يَتَكَفَّفُونَ النَّاسِ. To leave your inheritors rich is better than leaving them poor and dependent upon asking other people for money. Then the Prophet ﷺ tried to expand this companion's very narrow idea of what charity was. He said, وَإِنَّكَ لَن تُنْفِقَ نَفْقَةً تَبْتَغِي بِهَا وَجْهَ اللَّهِ إِلَّا أُجِرْتَ بِهَا حَتَّى مَا تَجْعَلُ فِي فِي امْرَأَتِكَ. Whatever you give to support other people, if you intend to please Allah by it, you will be rewarded for it, even the food that you provide for your own spouse. One of the keys to being moderate is realizing that everything that we do can be an act of worship. Everything. All we have to do is have the proper intention of pleasing Allah Azza wa Jalla. Returning to the Quran, in the next ayah, Allah Azza wa Jalla brings us back to the main point in all issues revolving around provision and charity, saying, إِنَّ رَبَّكَ يَبْسُطُ الرِّزْقَ لِمَن يَشَاءُ وَيَقْدِرُ إِنَّهُ كَانَ بِعِبَادِهِ خَبِيرًا بَصِيرًا. Surely your Lord extends or restricts His provision to whomever He wills. He is certainly all aware of everything, seeing everything when it comes to His servants. More important than what you give or what you take is your internal orientation of trust, of hope, of reliance upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You can give with your hand, but your heart might be afraid. Your heart might hesitate. Your heart might doubt Allah's wisdom. Allah wants us to put our trust in Him above everything else, which is why He reminds us here that He is completely informed and aware about our circumstances. That hope is essential because it keeps us from despair when our provision is limited, and it also keeps us from being arrogant and wasteful when our provision is abundant. The internal worship is much more important than the amount that we give. After Allah Azza wa Jalla deals with charity, He alerts us to a similar situation. وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَوْلَادَكُمْ خَشْيَةِ إِمْلَاقٍ نَحْنُ نَرْزُقُكُمْ وَإِيَّاكُمْ إِنَّ قَتْلَهُمْ كَانَ خِطَأً كَبِيرًا. Do not kill your children for fear of poverty. We provide for them and for you. Surely killing them is a heinous sin. Allah Azza wa Jalla is referring to a practice that was widespread at the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. People used to kill their infant children for fear that they were not going to be able to financially support them. This wraps two sins into one. The first, the external sin, is killing the human life which Allah Ta'ala has made sacred, as Allah will mention again shortly. The second part of the sin is internal. What motivation could possibly bring someone to kill their own child? The motivation is fear and lack of trust in Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. Allah makes a connection between this sin and the last sin. Every sin that results from a lack of trusting Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. When we are afraid and when we don't trust Allah, it's very easy for the devil to scare us into doing terrible things. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين من كل ذنب فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. After telling us to be careful not to commit certain sins which result from not fully trusting Allah, Allah then makes us aware of another sin that we must watch out for. وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا إِنَّهُ كَانَ فَاحِشَةً وَسَاءَ سَبِيلًا. Do not go near unlawful intercourse. It is truly a shameful deed and an evil way. Here Allah Ta'ala, He communicates several things in one very, very short, powerful ayah. First, Allah regulates the types of romantic relationships that we are allowed to have. It's important to point out that regulating which romantic relationships are acceptable and which are not acceptable is not unique to Islam. Every society and civilization regulates romantic relationships whether they admit it or not. In today's society, we have certain slogans and messages in the media that try to conceal this fact. Slogans such as, "Love is love," "Love wins," gives the impression that our society, or at least its quote-unquote enlightened citizens, supports every authentic expression of romantic love. This is simply false. Thankfully, some things are still off limits in our society. Children and animals are still considered off limits for romantic relationships, no matter how much a person swears that their feelings are authentic. Similarly, our society still recognizes that consent, while essential, is inadequate to determine which relationships are valid and which aren't. Every year, thousands and thousands of people choose to remain in abusive relationships despite the objective harm that it causes them. The second thing Allah Ta'ala tells us here is that this regulation of romantic relationships is based on our own individual and collective self-interest. Allah Azza wa Jalla uses two strong words here to show this. First, fahisha, which indicates something shameful and indecent. This lets us know that forbidden romantic relationships are against our own individual interests. And the second term, sa'a sabila, indicates an evil way. This lets us know that these forbidden romantic relationships harm the entire community. Now, someone who's not a Muslim, they might ask at this point, where's the harm? I don't see anyone getting hurt here. But our sense of what is harm as people of faith is not just limited to this body and this life. It includes the soul. It includes the afterlife. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us here that romantic relationships outside of Islamic marriage harm the soul and have potential consequences in the afterlife. If someone denies the existence of the soul and denies the afterlife, they will remain blind to this type of harm. But the harm of romantic relationships outside of Islamic marriage is not just limited to the soul or the afterlife. The harm is also emotional and physical. Emotional because neither person in such a relationship is fully committed to the other. Physically because you might give up the best years of your life to someone who doesn't care enough about you to fully commit to you. A relationship in which there is only intimacy and no commitment is indeed a shameful, humiliating arrangement. It's like renting a home versus owning one. You pay, and you pay, but at the end of the day, you have no equity. If the landlord puts up the building for sale, you walk away with nothing. Romantic relationships outside of Islamic marriage damage society in several ways, perhaps most profoundly through the children that are born from these relationships. Study after study after study shows that children born outside of marriage are more likely to have behavioral problems, more likely to struggle academically, more likely to get involved in drugs, more likely to get involved in crime. Romantic relationships outside of Islamic marriages sets our entire community back. The last and third thing that Allah tells us here is that this regulation is so important. Allah Azza wa Jal told us to not even approach it, to not even go near it. He didn't simply tell us to not have romantic relationships. وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا. Don't even come close to it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He wants to fulfill our deep needs for commitment, for love, for support. He wants our children to grow up in a household where commitment and love and support is never in doubt or in question. This is all made possible through Islamic marriage, which brings accountability and commitment to romantic relationships. Next, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا النَّفْسَ الَّتِي حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ إِلَّا بِالْحَقِّ وَمَنْ قُتِلَ مَظْلُومًا فَقَدْ جَعَلْنَا لِوَلِيِّهِ سُلْطَانًا فَلَا يُسْرِفْ فِي الْقَتْلِ إِنَّهُ كَانَ مَنْصُورًا. Do not take human life, which Allah made sacred, except by legal rights. If anyone is killed unjustly, then we have given their relatives the authority, but do not let them exceed the limits in retaliation, for the law is already on their side. If relationships can ruin individual lives, as well as the society, then so can murder, which is why Allah Azza wa Jal now turns our attention to this particular sin. The first thing that He tells us is that human life is sacred. This means every human life, Muslim and non-Muslim, black and white, it's all sacred. If something is sacred, it means it not only has to be protected, but it has to be honored. When people are dying due to injustice and oppression, we have to take it very seriously. It should bother us enough to take action. The next thing that Allah tells us is that He is the one who made it sacred, not us. Your life is not sacred because of the color of your skin. Your life is not sacred because of who your ancestors were, or any other man-made reason. Allah Azza wa Jal made your life sacred. And so protecting that life is part of a sacred duty. Then Allah Azza wa Jal tells us that there will be certain situations where it is acceptable to take human life, and these situations are extremely limited. They are limited to someone who breaks the law and someone who is on the battlefield. The first scenario is under the authority of the government. The second scenario is under the authority of the military. There is no vigilante justice in Islam. You are not allowed to take matters into your own hands and go punish people for what you think that they did. Everything must go through the proper channels and be supervised by the proper authorities. Now, some people may wonder, why does Allah allow the taking of human life at all? Isn't He the most merciful? Doesn't He forgive everything? Allah Azza wa Jal gives us the answer by saying that if someone is murdered, Allah has given that person's relatives the authority to decide. If they want to forgive, they can forgive. But if they want that other person punished, then they can do that instead. That is their decision to make. Allah Azza wa Jal is showing us that in Islam there is no mercy without justice. To forgive a murderer in this life while the family of the deceased is still grieving would show a lack of mercy to the family. So Allah Azza wa Jal has left it up to the family what happens in this life, and Allah Ta'ala will decide whether to forgive in the afterlife. Even then, Allah gives a warning to the family of the deceased: do not go overboard in retaliation. We see that Allah is warning us that if we are not aware of Allah's limits, it's very easy for yesterday's oppressed to become today's oppressor. Then Allah says, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا مَالَ الْيَتِيمِ إِلَّا بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ حَتَّى يَبْلُغَ أَشُدَّهُ وَأَوْفُوا بِالْعَهْدِ إِنَّ الْعَهْدَ كَانَ مَسْئُولًا. Do not come near the wealth of the orphan unless you intend to make it better. And honor your pledges, for you will surely be held accountable for them. Allah groups these two things together because caring for an orphan is like taking a pledge to do what's in their best interest. As Muslims, we do not just live for ourselves, we're supposed to improve the lives of everyone around us, especially those who are under our care. Part of uplifting everyone around us is to honor our pledges. If we want to be trusted, we must be trustworthy. We need to do what we said we are going to do. And Allah says, وَأَوْفُوا الْكَيْلَ إِذَا كِلْتُمْ وَزِنُوا بِالْقِسْطَاسِ الْمُسْتَقِيمِ ذَلِكَ خَيْرٌ وَأَحْسَنُ تَأْوِيلًا. Give in full when you measure and weigh with an even balance. That is fairest and best in the end. Simply put, don't cheat. Don't cut corners. Allah is using imagery here from a time when things used to be sold on scales. People who were dishonest would measure out a little bit less, whatever they could get away with when it came to somebody else. But when it was their turn, they would heap and heap and heap and push the limit of what was acceptable to take. Some people are like this. When it comes to them and their rights, they want to be paid in full. But when it comes to the rights of another person, now we have all the excuses why they shouldn't get their due justice. This is a mistake. Muslims have to treat everyone fairly and not give anyone, including ourselves, special treatment. Then Allah says, وَلَا تَقْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ إِنَّ السَّمْعَ وَالْبَصَرَ وَالْفُؤَادَ كُلُّ أُولَٰئِكَ كَانَ عَنْهُ مَسْئُولًا. Do not follow what you don't have any certain knowledge of. Indeed, everything will be called to account. Your hearing, your sight, and your intellect. The Prophet ﷺ told us that part of perfecting our obedience to Allah is minding our own business. We should not get involved in other people's business unless we have a clear intention to help them in some way. Allah Azza wa Jal tells us that we will be held accountable in the afterlife for how we use our senses, our hearing, our sight, and what we held in our hearts. وَلَا تَمْشِ فِي الْأَرْضِ مَرَحًا إِنَّكَ لَن تَخْرِقَ الْأَرْضَ وَلَن تَبْلُغَ الْجِبَالَ طُولًا. And do not walk on the earth arrogantly. Surely you can neither crack the earth nor stretch to the height of the mountains. At the end of the day, we are nothing. Do you think you're great because you're the imam of the masjid? Or because you're on the board of the masjid? Or because you drive an expensive car? It's all going to end up dust. It's all nothing, and it will all end. If you want to be just towards Allah's creation, including the earth itself and everything in it, then we have to begin with this correct attitude of humility and submission and service. كُلُّ ذَلِكَ كَانَ سَيِّئُهُ عِنْدَ رَبِّكَ مَكْرُوهًا. Violation of any of these commandments is detestable to your Lord. Allah has truly spelled everything out to us in detail. He is just, He is the guide, and He has spoken definitively about how He wants to be loved, how He wants to be served, and how He wants to be obeyed. ثم صلوا وسلموا على نبي رحمة كما أمركم ربكم حيث قال إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم بارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم أعز الإسلام والمسلمين وأذل الشرك والمشركين ودمر أعداء الدين وانصر عبادك المؤمنين واجعل اللهم بلاد الإسلام آمنا مطمئنا يا رب العالمين. Oh Allah, bring honor to Islam and the Muslims, and humiliate idolatry and the idolaters, and destroy the enemies of faith, and assist your believing servants, and make the lands of the Muslims safe and tranquil, O Sustainer of the universe. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء منهم والأموات يا سميع الدعاء. O Allah, forgive the believing men and women, forgive the Muslim men and women, those living and those deceased. O you who hear every prayer. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. O Allah, let us see the truth for what it is and grant us the ability to follow it. Let us see falsehood for what it is and grant us the ability to avoid it. يا عباد الله إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون. فاذكروا الله يذكركم واشكروه على نعمه يزدكم والله يعلم ما تصنعون.
الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. آمين. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا يسخر قوم من قوم عسى أن يكونوا خيرا منهم ولا نساء من نساء عسى أن يكن خيرا منهن ولا تلمزوا أنفسكم ولا تنابزوا بالألقاب بئس الاسم الفسوق بعد الإيمان ومن لم يتب فأولئك هم الظالمون. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. آمين. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اجتنبوا كثيرا من الظن إن بعض الظن إثم ولا تجسسوا ولا يغتب بعضكم بعضا أيحب أحدكم أن يأكل لحم أخيه ميتا فكرهتموه واتقوا الله الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر السلام عليكم ورحمة الله